Indiana University Press of Bloomington, Indiana University of Bloomington. John Dewey, whose theories of knowledge and learning revolutionized educational practice in the United States early in the 20th century, and eloquently summarized in these readings the new philosophy of pragmatism or instrumentalism, whose orientation he found in Darwin's Origins of Species. Dewey argued that classical philosophies have to be revised because they must be squared up with the conquest of the sciences by the experimental method of inquiry, the injection of evolutionary ideas into the study of life and society, the application of the historic method to religions and morals, as well as to the institutions, the creation of the sciences of origins, and of the cultural development of humankind. Darwin's theories of biological evolution and his principle of natural selection undercut all the philosophies insistent in the belief of fixed first and final causes for all phenomena of life, and in so doing freed the new logic for application to mind and morals and life as well. Philosophy from this point of view introduces responsibility into the intellectual life for humankind, who is neither a supernal being nor a transcendent cause, one who must answer for the validity of his or her thought as it applies to human life and conduct. The problem of knowledge, Part 3. The rationalist, in making the concept or general idea the all-important things in knowledge, believes him or herself to be asserting the interests of order as against destructive caprice and the license of momentary whim. He finds that in his cause that it is bound up with that of the discovery of truth as the necessary instrument and method for action. Only by reference to the general and the rational can the individual find perspective, secure direction for his appetites and impulses, and escape from the uncontrolled and ruinous reactions of his own immediate tendency. The concept, once more, in its very generality, in its elevation above the intensities and conflicts of momentary passions and interests, is the conserver of the experience of the past. It is the wisdom of the past put into capitalized and funded form to enable the individual to get away from the stress and competition of the needs of the passing moment. It marks the difference between barbarism and civilization, between continuity and disintegration, between the sequence of tradition that is the necessity of intelligent thought and action, and the random and confused excitation of the hour. When we thus consider not the details of the positions of the sensationalist and rationalist, but the motives that have induced them to assume their positions, we discover what is meant in saying that the question is still a practical, a social one, and that the two schools stand for certain one-sided factors of social life. If we have on one side the demand for freedom, for personal initiation into experience, for variety and progress, we have on the other side the demand for general order, for continuous and organized unity, for the conservation of the dearly bought resources of the past. This is what I mean by saying that the sensationalist abstracts in conscious form the position and tendency of the Germanic element in modern civilization, the factor of appetite and impulse, of keen enjoyment and satisfaction, of stimulus and initiative. Just so the rationalist erects into conscious abstraction the principle of the Greco-Roman world of classical antiquity, that of control, of system, of order and authority. That the principles of freedom and order, of past and future, or conservation and progress, of incitement to action and control of that incitation, are correlative, I shall not stop to argue. It may be worthwhile, however, to point out that exactly the same correlative and mutually implicating connection exists between sensationalism and rationalism, considered as philosophical accounts of the origin and nature of knowledge. The strength of each school lies in the weakness of its opponent. The more the sensationalist appears to succeed in reducing knowledge to the associations of sensation, the more he or she creates a demand for thought to introduce background and relationship. The more consistent the sensationalist, the more openly he or she reveals the sensation in its own nakedness, crying aloud for a clothing of value and meaning, which must be borrowed from reflective and rational interpretation. On the other hand, the more reason and the system of relations that make up the functioning of reason are magnified, the more is felt the need of sensation to bring reason into some fruitful contact with the materials of experience. Reason must have the stimulus of this contact in order to be incited to its work and to get materials to operate with. The cause, then, why neither school can come to rest in itself is precisely that each abstracts one essential factor of conduct. This suggests, finally, that the next move in philosophy is precisely to transfer attention from the details of the position assumed and the arguments used in these two schools to the practical motives that have unconsciously controlled the discussion. The positions have been sufficiently elaborated within the past 100 years, and again, we're talking about Dewey writing here in the early 20th century. And he says, within especially the last generation, each has succeeded in fully stating its case. The result, if we remain at this point, is practically a deadlock. Each can make out its own case against the other. To stop at such a point, however, is a patent absurdity. If we are to get out of the cul-de-sac, it must be by bringing into consciousness the tacit reference to action that all the time has been the controlling factor. In a word, another great rhythmic movement is seen to be approaching its end. The demand for science and philosophy was the demand for truth and a sure standard of truth which the newborn individual might employ in his or her efforts to build up a new world to afford free scope to the powers stirring within them. The urgency and acuteness of this demand caused for the time being the transfer of attention from the nature of practice to that of knowledge. The highly theoretical and abstract character of modern epistemology, combined with the fact that this highly abstract and theoretic problem has continuously engaged the attention of thought for more than 3 centuries, is, to my mind, proof positive that the question of knowledge was for the time being the point in which the question of practice centered, and through which it must find outlet and solution. We return then to our opening problem, the meaning of the question of the possibility of knowledge, raised by Immanuel Kant a century ago, and of his assertion that sensation without thought is blind, thought without sensation empty. Once more, I recall to the student of philosophy how this assertion of Kant has haunted and determined the course of philosophy in the intervening years, how his solution at once seems inevitable and unsatisfactory. It is inevitable that no one can fairly deny that both sense and reason are implicated in every fruitful and significant statement of the world. Unconvincing because we are, after all, left with these two opposed things, still at war with each other, plus the miracle of their final combination. When I say that the only way out is to place the whole modern industry of epistemology in relation to the conditions that gave it birth and the function it has to fulfill, I mean that the unsatisfactory character of the entire Neo-Kantian movement lies in its assumption that knowledge gives birth to itself and is capable of affording its own justification. The solution that is always sought and never found so long as we deal with knowledge as a self-sufficing purveyor of reality reveals itself when we conceive of knowledge as a statement of action, that statement being necessary, moreover, to the successful ongoing of action. The entire problem of medieval philosophy is that of absorption, of assimilation. The result was the creation of the individual. Hence, the problem of modern life is that of reconstruction, reform, reorganization. The entire context of experience needs to be passed through the alembic of individual agency and realization. The individual is to be the bearer of civilization, but this involves a remaking of the civilization that he bears. Thus we have the dual question: how can the individual become the organ of corporate action? How can he or she make over the truth authoritatively embodied in institutions of church and state into frank, healthy, and direct expressions of the simple act of free living? On the other hand, how can civilization preserve its own integral value and import when subordinated to the agency of the individual instead of exercising supreme sway over him or herself? The question of knowledge, of the discovery and statement of truth, gives the nature and the answer to this question, and it alone gives the answer. admitting that the practical problem of modern life is the maintenance of the moral values of civilization through the medium of the insight and decision of the individual. The problem is foredoomed to futile failure, save as the individual in performing his task can work with a definite and controllable tool. This tool is science. But this very fact, constituting the dignity of science and measuring the importance of the philosophic theory of knowledge, conferring upon them the religious value once set teaching to dogma and the disciplinary significance once belonging to political rules, also sets their limit. The servant is not above his master. When a theory of knowledge forgets that its value rests in solving the problem out of which it has arisen, that of securing a method of action, when it forgets that it has to work out the conditions under which the individual may freely direct him or herself without loss to the historic values of civilization, when it forgets these things, it begins to cumber the ground. It is luxury and hence a social nuisance and disturber. Of course, in the very nature of things, every means or instrument will for a while absorb attention so that it becomes the end. Indeed, it is the end when it is an indispensable condition of onward movement. But when once the means have been worked out, they must operate as such. When the nature and method of knowledge are fairly understood, then interest must transfer itself from the possibility of knowledge to the possibility of its application to life. The sensationalist has played his part in bringing to effective recognition the demand in valid knowledge for individuality of experience, for personal participation in materials of knowledge. The rationalist has served his time in making it clear once and for all the valid knowledge, and that valid knowledge requires organization and the operation of a relatively permanent and general factor. The Kantian epistemologist has formulated the claims of both schools in defining judgment as the relation of perception and conception. But when it goes on to state that this relation is itself knowledge, or can be found in knowledge, it stultifies itself. Knowledge can define the precept or percept and elaborate the concept, but their union can be found only in action. The experimental method of modern science, its erection into the ultimate mode of verification, is simply this fact-obtaining recognition. Only action can reconcile the old, the general, and the permanent with the changing, the individual and the new. It is action as progress, as development, making over the wealth of the past into capital with which to do an enlarging and freer business that alone can find its way out of the cul-de-sac of the theory of knowledge. Each of the older movements passed away because of its own success, failed because it did not do its work, died in accomplishing its purpose. So also with the modern philosophy of knowledge, there must come a time when we have so much knowledge in detail and understand so well its method in general that it ceases to be a problem. It becomes a tool at that point, and if the knowledge problem is not intrinsically meaningless and absurd, it must in course of time be solved. Then the dominating interest becomes the use of knowledge, the conditions under which and ways in which it may be most organically and effectively employed to direct conduct. And thus the Socratic period recurs, but recurs with the deepened meaning of the intervening weary years of struggle, confusion, and conflict in the growth of the recognition of the need of patient and specific methods of interrogation. So too the authoritative and institutional truth of scholasticism recurs, but recurs borne up upon the vigorous and conscious shoulders of the freed individual, who is indeed aware of his or her own intrinsic relations to truth, and who glories in their ability to carry civilization, not merely to carry it, but to carry it on. Thus another swing in the rhythm of theory and practice begins. How does this concern us as philosophers? For the world it means that philosophy is henceforth a method and not an original fountainhead of truth, nor an ultimate standard of reference. But what is involved for philosophy itself in this change? I make no claims to being a prophet, but I venture one more and final unproved statement, believing with all of my thought that it is justified both by the moving logic of the situation and by the signs of the time. I refer to the growing transfer of interest from metaphysics and the theory of knowledge to psychology and social ethics, including in the latter term all the related concrete social sciences, insofar as they may give guidance to conduct. There are those who see in psychology only a particular science which they are pleased to term purely empirical. unless it happened to restate in changed phraseology the metaphysics with which they are familiar. They see it only as a more or less incoherent mass of facts, interesting because it relates to human nature, but below the nature of the world and the natural sciences in point of certainty and definiteness, as also far below pure philosophy as to the comprehensiveness and ability to deal with fundamental issues. But if I may be permitted to dramatize a little the position of the psychologist, he or she can well afford to continue patiently at work, unmindful of the occasional supercilious sneers of the epistemologist. The cause of modern civilization stands and falls with the ability of the individual to serve as its agent and bearer, and psychology is naught but the account of the way in which individual life is thus progressively maintained and reorganized. Psychology is the attempt to state in detail the machinery of the individual considered as the instrument and organ through which social action operates. It is the answer to Kant's demand for the formal phase of experience, how experience as such is constituted. And just because the whole burden and stress, both of conserving and advancing experience, is more and more thrown upon the individual, everything which sheds light upon how the individual may weather the stress and assume the burden is precious and imperious. Social ethics is inclusive sense, in a inclusive sense, is the correlative science. Dealing not with the form of mode or machinery of action, it attempts rather to make out its filling up and make up the values that are necessary to constitute an experience which is worthwhile. The sociologist, like the psychologist, often presents him or herself as a camp follower of genuine science and philosophy, picking up scraps here and there and piecing them together in somewhat of an aimless fashion. Fortunate indeed, if not vague and over-ambitious. Yet social ethics represents the attempt to translate philosophy from a general and therefore abstract method into a working and specific method. It is the change from inquiring into the nature of value in general to inquiring as to the particular values that ought to be realized in the life of every person, and as to the conditions which render possible this realization. There are those who will see in this conception of the outcome of a 400-year discussion concerning the nature and possibility of knowledge a derogation from the high estate of philosophy. There still are others who will see in it a sign that philosophy, after wandering aimlessly hither and yon in a wilderness without purpose or outcome, has finally come to its senses, has given up metaphysical absurdities and unverifiable speculations, and has indeed become a purely positive science of phenomena. But there are yet others who will still see in this movement the fulfillment of its vocation, the clear consciousness of a function that it has always striven to perform, and who will welcome it as a justification of the long centuries when it appeared to sit apart, far from the common concerns of man and women, busied with discourse of essence and cause, absorbed in argument concerning subject and object, reason and sensation. To such this outcome will appear the inevitable sequel of the saying of Socrates, that, quote, an unexamined life is not one fit to be led by a man, and a better response to his injunction, know thyself.